The first time Ella Aldridge fired a rifle, she was 9 years old, standing over the body of a rattlesnake that had come within 2 feet of ending her mother's life. And from that moment forward, she never once waited for someone else to pull the trigger. That was the truth of her, the marrow-deep truth that no amount of years or miles or loneliness had managed to soften. By the time she was 26 and running the Aldridge homestead alone on the eastern edge of the New Mexico Territory in the year 1878, she had built herself into something that the other settlers whispered about with a mixture of admiration and unease. She had buried her father when she was 17, lost to a fever that swept through the territory like a brush fire. She had buried her mother 2 years after that, taken by the same relentless land that had promised them everything and delivered mostly hardship. She had no brothers, no sisters, no cousins close enough to ride to. She had the homestead, 73 acres of scrubland and red dust, and a creek that ran thin in summer, and she had her own 2 hands, and she had decided long ago that those were sufficient. The ranch itself was modest but solid. A timber-framed house that she had re-roofed herself the previous spring, a barn that leaned slightly to the west as if the wind had made up its mind about something, a small vegetable garden along the south wall where tomatoes and beans and squash grew in careful rows, and a pasture that held 4 horses and a small herd of cattle she sold once a year in Tucumcari. She kept the fence lines mended. She kept the well clean. She kept the accounts in a leather-bound ledger her father had given her, and she kept them accurate to the last cent. The people of the nearest town, a dust-blown place called Harlow's Crossing with a single main street and a general store that doubled as the post office, had long since stopped offering to help her, not because they were unkind, but because she had made it perfectly clear in ways both spoken and unspoken that help was not something she was looking for. She traded at the general store. She nodded at the men she passed on the road. She attended the occasional town meeting when a matter affected her land. And then she rode back out to her 73 acres, and the quiet that lived there like an old companion she had come to prefer above most human company. She was not a hard woman in the way people sometimes imagined hardness. She laughed when something was genuinely funny. She had a fondness for the particular color the sky turned on clear evenings, that deep bruised violet that settled in just before full dark, and she sometimes sat on the porch steps and watched it with something close to reverence. She read when she could get books, which was not often enough. She was kind to animals in the matter-of-fact way of someone who understood that animals asked nothing of you except care, and delivered loyalty without conditions. But she had learned, through loss and through the sheer arithmetic of surviving alone, that needing people was a liability she could not afford. Every person she had leaned on had eventually been taken from her by this land, or by time, or by the simple physics of human fragility. So she had stopped leaning. She had straightened her own spine and decided that was the better architecture for the life ahead of her. That was the woman Chester Redmond rode toward on a Tuesday morning in early April, 1878, his horse limping badly on a left foreleg, a saddlebag that was nearly empty, and a paper folded in his breast pocket that described Harlow's Crossing as a place a man might find work. Chester was 29 years old and had spent the last 4 years drifting across the territories the way some men do when they are not yet ready to land somewhere, but are tired enough of moving that they think about it constantly. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown past the collar of his worn canvas coat, and a jaw that always seemed to carry 2 days of beard regardless of when he had last shaved. His eyes were the particular brown of creek water in autumn, warm and slow-moving, and they had a quality that unnerved some people. The quality of actually looking at whoever was in front of him, fully and without haste, as though he had nowhere more important to be than this exact conversation. He had been a ranch hand in Texas, a trail driver out of Abilene, a freighter along the Santa Fe route. He was good with horses and better with cattle, and could fix most things that broke if given enough time and the right tools. He was not a violent man by nature, though he had lived in places where violence was ambient as weather, and he had learned to handle himself without enjoying it. He carried a Colt revolver on his hip as a matter of practical sense rather than affectation. He had no family waiting for him anywhere. He had a handful of coin left, and a horse that needed rest, and a persistent, gnawing sense that he was looking for something he had not yet found the name for. He saw the Aldridge homestead from the road, recognized it as a working ranch by the quality of the fence lines, and turned his limping horse down the approach without much calculation. He needed water for the horse at minimum. If the place had a kind owner, maybe a meal and a night in the barn. He had asked for less and received it, and he had asked for more and been turned away, and he had learned to hold both possibilities lightly. Ella was in the corral when she heard the hoofbeats, mending a section of fence with wire and pliers, and a vocabulary of quiet frustration she saved for inanimate objects that refused to cooperate. She looked up and assessed the approaching rider the way she assessed most things, quickly, practically, with her hands still on the tools. She saw the horse's gait first, the favored foreleg, the wet around the cannon bone. Then she saw the man, the trail-worn coat, the saddlebags that hung flat, the posture of someone who was tired but not desperate enough to be dangerous about it. She did not put the pliers down. "Gates around the front," she called out, not unkindly but not warmly either. The tone of a woman who was busy and would give you your 60 seconds. Chester pulled up outside the fence and tipped his hat. "Thank you, ma'am. I can see you're working. I won't take long. My horse has come up lame, and I was wondering if you might let me water him at your trough and rest him an hour or so before I push on to town." Ella looked at the horse again. The animal was standing with the weight off the left foreleg, nostrils working, clearly uncomfortable. Whatever she thought of the man, the horse had done nothing to deserve her suspicion. "Bring him around," she said. Slowly. Chester walked the horse to the trough at the side of the barn. Ella finished the wire section she was working on and came around after him, wiping her hands on the legs of her canvas trousers. She wore trousers, had for years, a decision the town had long ago stopped commenting on because she had made clear in her brisk way that commentary was neither needed nor welcome. She crouched beside the horse's foreleg without asking Chester's permission, which he noticed, and examined the leg with careful hands. The horse submitted to this without protest, which told Chester something about the quality of the woman's touch. "Stone bruise," she said, standing. "Could be worse. He shouldn't carry you to town on it today." She looked up at Chester directly, and he had the sensation he sometimes had with particular people, the sensation of being looked at rather than merely seen. "I've got an empty stall. He can rest the day," Chester nodded. "I appreciate that more than I can say. If there's work I can do in exchange, I'm willing." "There's always work," Ella said. It was not an invitation so much as a fact, delivered with the flatness of someone who had been saying that sentence to the empty air for years. Split woods the most pressing, stacks running low. And so that was how it began. Not with ceremony or attraction or any conscious recognition on either side that the other person was anything more than a useful stranger in a large and indifferent territory. Chester Redmond split wood for Ella Aldridge for 3 hours that afternoon, stacking it with the methodical precision of a man who had done a great deal of physical labor and found a kind of peace in it. Ella went about her own work, feeding and checking on her horses, beginning the first stage of a batch of soap that she would sell at the general store, mending a shirt that had given out at the elbow. She brought him water at midday without comment. He drank it and said thank you and went back to work. She noticed that he worked steadily and without performance, no great show of effort, just the quiet, reliable rhythm of someone who knew how to sustain himself over long labor. She noted it the way she noted any useful quality in a working animal or a good tool, with neutral appreciation. By late afternoon, when the light was going golden and the shadows stretched long across the yard, She came to tell him his horse looked better. Chester was finishing the last of the wood, setting the final split log onto the stack with a satisfaction that was entirely unperformed. "He's moving easier," she said, standing at a comfortable distance, her arms folded not in hostility but in the habitual posture of a woman who had learned to take up less space in the presence of strangers while still making clear this was her land. "You could ride to town in the morning without hurting him." Chester looked at the horse, then at her. "You probably saved his leg," he said. "I'm grateful." "It was a stone bruise," she said. "Nothing dramatic." He almost smiled. "You downplay things." She looked at him with a slight sharpening of attention as though she was recalibrating her assessment. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." "Fair enough," Chester said, and there was warmth in it without pressure, a genuine acknowledgement rather than a concession, and Ella felt something small and unidentifiable shift somewhere between her ribs. She ignored it efficiently. She offered him supper and a blanket in the barn because it was the decent thing to do, and she was, beneath the self-sufficiency, a decent woman. He ate the beans and cornbread she made with obvious appreciation, and he did not try to fill the silence with unnecessary talk, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He answered when she asked him something, which she did twice, where he was headed, and what kind of work he was looking for, and his answers were direct and without embellishment. He was looking for ranch work in Harlow's Crossing. He had heard there might be something available at the Fowler operation north of town. He did not have grand plans, he had practical ones. She respected that. In the morning his horse was walking well enough, and she watched him saddle up in the early gray light before the sun had properly decided to appear, and she thought, with the distant practicality of someone who has been alone a long time, that he was a decent sort of man, and she hoped he found what he was looking for. "I'll send word if the Fowler place doesn't work out," Chester said from the saddle, which surprised her. "Why would you do that?" she said. "Because you've got a lot of fence to mend and not enough hands," he said, and he said it without arrogance or pity, just the same quality of accuracy she had claimed for herself the night before, and she found she had no good argument against it. "And because your woodpile won't last the season even with what I added." She looked at him for a moment. "I manage," she said. "I know you do," Chester said simply. And then he rode toward town. That was different. Ella stood in her yard and watched the horse and rider diminish against the early morning landscape and turned those 3 words over in her mind. "I know you do." Not said with doubt underneath it, not a polite cover over the skepticism she usually heard from men who told her she was doing fine for a woman on her own, as if the qualification were the genuine meaning. Just a plain acknowledgement, offered and then moved past, as though there were nothing remarkable about it. She went back to work. She told herself she would not think about Chester Redmond again after that morning. She thought about him 4 times before noon. The Fowler operation turned out to be poorly run and worse managed, and Chester could see within a day of asking around Harlow's Crossing that working for Dale Fowler would mean bad pay, unclear terms, and the kind of daily friction that came from a boss who confused authority with competence. He asked around some more. He bought himself a meal at the Harlow's Crossing saloon, which also served food, a bowl of venison stew that was considerably better than its surroundings suggested, and listened to the talk of the other men in the room. The talk was, among other things, about Ella Aldridge. She came up in the way she always came up in town, with the particular mixture of admiration and bafflement that she seemed to inspire in equal measure. "The woman out at the Aldridge place, she runs it herself, did you know that, has done since her folks passed. Doesn't ask for anything. Doesn't want help. Stubborn as the land itself. Beautiful, too, if you got close enough, though she'd probably not thank you for noticing." Chester listened and said nothing, and thought about the quiet, direct woman who had read his horse's injury in 30 seconds and downplayed a kindness by calling it accuracy. He went back to the Aldridge homestead the following week. He told himself he was going to offer to work through the spring at a fair daily rate, because she genuinely did need the labor and he genuinely needed the income, and it was a practical arrangement that made sense for both parties. He rode down the approach and found her on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles. He stopped his horse and looked up at her for a moment. She was 40 feet off the ground on a barn roof, alone, swinging a hammer with brisk efficiency, and it occurred to him that she was both the most self-sufficient and the most stubbornly solitary person he had encountered in 4 years of traveling across this particular stretch of America. "I came to discuss work," he called up. Ella drove the last nail on the shingle she was setting and looked down at him without particularly obvious surprise, though she had not expected him to come back. She had told herself she had not expected him to come back. "I'm listening," she said from the roof. He laid out the terms he was thinking. She countered. They arrived at a number that was fair, which she knew because she had done the arithmetic, and he knew because he had done the same arithmetic independently, and arrived at the same fair number before he'd even opened his mouth. She came down from the roof without making a ceremony of it and shook his hand, her grip firm and businesslike. And that was that. Chester Redmond began working the Aldridge homestead in the 3rd week of April, 1878, and the arrangement was professional and clearly delineated from the first morning. He slept in the barn on a cot he set up in the empty stall, taking his meals in the kitchen when Ella offered, which she did once a day, supper, because it was efficient to cook for 2 rather than 1. He was present and hardworking, and he did not crowd her. He gave her room the way you give room to a wild thing that has decided it might tolerate your proximity, carefully, without sudden movements. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she resented the awareness, because it implied she was the kind of person who needed to be managed, which she was not. She said nothing about it. She simply watched him work and found nothing to criticize, which was in itself a novelty. The fence lines got mended properly. 2 sections of the pasture that had been sagging for months were reset and reinforced. Chester repaired the lean in the barn by digging out the south post and resetting it in new concrete mix that he hauled from town, a job that took 3 days and that Ella had been meaning to address for 2 years and hadn't managed because the cattle always seemed more pressing. He did it without comment, without asking her permission, because the lean was obviously a problem and fixing problems was what he was being paid for. She watched him work one afternoon from the kitchen window while she was at the stove, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, working the post with steadiness and patience, and she caught herself watching with something that had nothing to do with evaluating the quality of the repair. She moved away from the window immediately. "Don't be foolish," she said to the stove, who received this advice without argument. What she had not anticipated, though she perhaps should have, was that Chester Redmond was genuinely interesting to talk to. She had expected competence. She had not expected depth. But in the evenings when she set supper on the table and they ate together in the kitchen, she found that conversations with him went places she hadn't been in a long time. He had read widely, in the unplanned way of self-educated men, picking up books wherever they could be found, and then leaving them behind when his saddlebags ran out of room. He had opinions about what he'd read that were thoughtful and specific, and he was willing to disagree with her, which was rare. Most people either agreed with Ella immediately, because she stated things with such quiet certainty, or they disagreed in the aggressive way that men often did with a woman, turning it into something other than a discussion. Chester simply said, "Well, I'm not sure I see it that way," and then told her why, and then listened to her response, and he meant all of it. She found herself lingering at the table longer than she needed to. She found herself saving things to tell him at supper, observations made during the day, a strange cloud formation over the south pasture, something she had read in the newspaper that had come with the last supply run, a particular thing one of the horses had done that struck her as funny. She noted this with alarm. She was not a person who saved things to tell other people. She was a person who processed everything internally and efficiently and moved on. One evening in mid-May, The sky turned spectacular in that bruised violet way she loved, and she was sitting on the porch steps with the last of her coffee when Chester came around from the barn and stopped, seeing the sky. He stood there without speaking for a long moment. Then he sat down on the steps 2 feet away from her, and they watched the last of the light go down together without a word, and it was the most comfortable Ella had ever felt in the presence of another person since her mother had been alive, and that recognition terrified her somewhere in the deep, carefully constructed architecture of her self-sufficiency. She got up and went inside and washed her cup and told herself it meant nothing. The trouble with Chester Redmond was that he noticed things. Not in an intrusive way, not in the way of a man who is keeping inventory of a woman's weaknesses, but in the way of someone who was genuinely paying attention. He noticed when she favored her right hand, and he found out only by asking that she had a scar on the left palm from a wire fence accident years ago that still pulled in cold weather. He noticed when she was quiet in a particular way, a tighter quiet than her usual self-contained silence, and he learned to leave her in it rather than attempt to speak through it, which was exactly the right response, and she knew it, and it unsettled her further. He also noticed that she never asked for anything. That when a crate at the general store was too heavy, she would rearrange it rather than ask the man standing 3 feet away to lift it. That when she was tired, she pressed on without acknowledgement. That when she was uncertain about something, she spent twice as long solving it independently rather than asking for input. He saw all of this with the same warm, patient attention he brought to everything, and he said nothing about it, because he understood, in the way of an observant and quiet person, that she would close like a door if he tried to name it too early. But one evening in late May, she made a mistake with the accounts. It was a subtraction error, small, the kind anyone could make after a long day, but it threw off the whole column, and she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and could not find it. She had been at it an hour. Chester was at the table too, cleaning and oiling the parts of a harness that had needed attention. He could see her frustration in the set of her jaw, the way her pencil tapped the margin in short, controlled beats. "Let me look," he said. "I'll find it," she said. "I know you will," he said. He waited. Then, not unkindly, not as a challenge, just as a gentle fact, "I'm better at columns than I look." She looked at him. There was a quality to her look that he recognized as the moment before a door either opened or closed. He held very still, figuratively, which was to say he didn't press, didn't add anything, just stayed in the warmth of the kitchen with the harness in his hands and let the choice be entirely hers. She turned the ledger around and pushed it across the table. He found the error in 3 minutes. She saw it the moment he put his finger on it, a 7 she had written that could also be read as a 1 in her own hand, which had thrown the column. She felt the faint heat of embarrassment and suppressed it. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, and turned the ledger back and went back to the harness. No comment on it. No softening look that implied he understood what it had cost her. Just the practical gift given and received and set aside, which was precisely what she needed, and she did not understand how he knew that, and the not understanding was its own small vertigo. The town of Harlow's Crossing had noticed, naturally, because small western towns in 1878 ran on the same thing they have always run on, which was other people's business. By early June, when Chester had been at the Aldridge homestead for 6 weeks, there was talk. Most of it was curious rather than malicious. The way talk usually was in small communities that lived close to the rawness of the land, and therefore found human drama a welcome relief. Folks wondered if the two of them had something going on. A few people thought it was improper, a woman and a man in such close quarters without the sanctity of marriage or even the suggestion of it. A few others, largely the women who had known Ella since childhood and admired her fierce competence, simply said they were glad someone was out there helping her whether she liked it or not. Ella heard the talk on her next supply run, filtered through the careful way people spoke to her, the slight sideways quality in Mrs. Haynes's greeting, the more obvious curiosity in the general store keeper's questions about how the ranch was coming along. She rode back to the homestead with a face like closed shutters and a feeling in her chest that was partly anger and partly something more complicated. She told Chester that evening at supper. Directly, because she was a direct person, and she looked at him across the table with eyes that were steady but not entirely comfortable. "People are talking about you being here," she said. Chester set down his fork and gave her the courtesy of his full attention. "I expected they would," he said. "It doesn't bother you." "No," he said. "Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer, and Chester waited in the unhurried way that was becoming, she realized, one of the things about him she was most aware of. "I don't care what people say about me," she said finally. "I never have." "But," he said, gently, not pushing, just opening the door a small crack. "But I don't want you to be in an uncomfortable position," she said, which was not quite the complete truth but was a portion of it, and he could see that, and he also had the grace not to point it out. "I'm comfortable where I am," he said simply. "If you still need the work done and I'm still doing it well, that seems like the thing that matters." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her fork and went back to eating, and the matter was, on the surface, closed. But something in her had registered the way he'd said it, not defensively, not seeking reassurance, not making it about himself. Just stating where he stood with the same uncomplicated steadiness he brought to everything. She was in trouble, she thought. She was in serious trouble. What happened in the second week of June had the quality of an accident, the way most important things in a human life announce themselves without ceremony and without warning. She was checking the south fence line on horseback in her mare, a gray named Juniper who was reliable to the point of stubbornness, spooked at a jackrabbit that burst from the scrub grass and went sideways hard enough that Ella, who had not been paying perfect attention because she had been thinking about something, went over the side. She landed on her shoulder in the red dirt. Nothing broke. She was annoyed rather than hurt, which was her typical relationship with physical setback, and she was up on her feet in under a minute. But Chester had been working the same fence line from the other end, and he had seen her go down, and he came at a gallop and arrived to find her standing, dusty, brushing herself off with the expression of someone who was primarily irritated at themselves. He pulled up and dismounted and came toward her, and his face had in it something she had not expected, which was a controlled but genuine fear, the kind that comes when you care about someone more than you had quite admitted to yourself. "I'm fine," she said immediately, because it was true and because she always led with that. "I can see that," he said, and there was a slight roughness in his voice that she recognized now, after 8 weeks of learning his voice, as emotion breaking the surface. He stopped a foot from her, and he looked at her with that full, warm, unhurried attention, and then he did something that startled her. He reached out and pushed the hair that had come loose in the fall back from her face, very gently, his thumb brushing her jaw for just a second, and then he stepped back. They were both very still for a moment. The land around them was enormous and quiet. The mare had stopped 20 feet away and was calmly cropping at whatever grew in the dry red soil. "I should not have done that," Chester said. His voice was even, but it had that roughness in it still. Ella was not a woman who was easily flustered, but she was aware of a warmth in her chest and a very specific difficulty in knowing what to do with her hands. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her hat from the ground and put it back on. "We should finish the fence line," she said. "Yes," he said. They finished the fence line. They did not talk much, and the quality of the quiet between them was different now, charged with something that they were both choosing by unspoken agreement not to name yet. That night at supper, the air in the kitchen was different too. Not uncomfortable exactly, but aware. She poured his coffee without asking if he wanted more, which she sometimes did, and he said thank you. And when their eyes met across the kitchen, the usual steadiness in his was there but overlaid with something, some careful attention that she understood was not new, had perhaps not been new for some time, and that he had been very disciplined about not letting her see before now. She sat down at the table. She put her hands around her own cup. She looked at the middle of the table rather than at him, because she was constructing something internally, trying to build a sentence out of the materials available to her, which were mostly fear and pride, and a longing she had not let herself identify until this moment. "I have spent my entire adult life," she said slowly to the middle of the table, "making certain I did not need anyone. It was not vanity, it was mathematics. Everyone I needed left, died or left, or the land took them, and I was still here, and the only rational conclusion was to stop needing." Chester was very quiet. He did not move. "I am telling you this," she said, "so that you understand that whatever," she paused, chose the word carefully, "whatever this is or whatever it might be, I am not built for dependence. I am not going to become someone who cannot function without you. That is not something I am capable of." There was a long silence. Then Chester said, "I know." She looked up at him. "I knew that before the second day," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely serious. "I'm not looking for someone to depend on me. I'm not looking to be needed in that way." He met her eyes without hesitation. "I just want to be here, with you the way you are, not in spite of how you are. Not hoping you'll soften or change or decide you need something you don't need." He paused. "You're the most capable person I've ever known. I wouldn't want to diminish that by a fraction." Ella looked at him for a long time. She had heard in her life many things said to her about her self-sufficiency. She had heard it called admirable and frightening and unfeminine and impressive and sad, depending on the person and their particular agenda. She had never heard anyone simply say, "I know," and stay in the room with the knowledge and find it not a problem. She did not know what to do with it. She stood up and went to the window and stood there with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the dark yard and the barn and the pasture beyond, at the land that was hers and that she had kept and that had kept her in its rough, uncompromising way. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said aloud in years. The admission cost her, and they both felt the price of it in the room. "Neither do I," Chester said. "But I'm not leaving, if that helps." She stood at the window a little longer. Then she turned around. She crossed the kitchen and sat back down at the table and picked up her coffee cup. "Finish your supper," she said, but her voice had lost its armor just slightly, just enough that he could hear the difference. He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had ever seen on his face, quiet and warm and directed entirely at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. June moved into July, and the heat of the New Mexico Territory summer settled over the land like a deliberate thing, heavy and complete. The work did not stop for heat, because it never did on a working ranch. And Ella and Chester moved through the long, bright days with the particular rhythm of two people who are learning each other in the organic way, through proximity and labor and small moments of attention. She noticed that he was a man of habits, and that his habits were good ones. He was up before her most mornings, which surprised her when she first discovered it, because she had always been the first one up on the homestead and had not expected to find someone had already made the coffee. He moved quietly, which she respected. He had a tendency to hum when he was working alone, low and without a particular tune, just sound, and she heard it sometimes from across the yard and found it inexplicably comforting in a way she never acknowledged. He noticed that she was different in the mornings, more open somehow, less constructed, before the day had fully taken hold of her. She would stand on the porch with her first cup of coffee and look at the eastern horizon with a particular stillness that was not her usual efficient stillness, but something quieter, closer to vulnerability, and she did not seem to know that he saw this, or she had decided he was safe enough to allow it, and either way he treated it with the same care he brought to everything about her. On a Saturday evening in mid-July, there was a gathering at the Harlow's Crossing Church, a social occasion that served as the town's periodic reminder that people needed each other's company. There was music, a fiddle and a banjo, and there was food, and there was the communal loosening that happened when hard-working people gave themselves permission to simply be people for an evening. Chester asked Ella if she wanted to go. She looked at him with her characteristic wariness. "You want to attend the church social?" "I want to take you," he said, with the same uncomplicated directness he had, and it made a difference, the specificity of it, not "I want to go, but I want to take you." They rode into town together, as the evening was cooling toward bearable. The gathering was in the churchyard, lanterns strung between the elm trees, long tables set with food, people in their better clothing moving through the warm July evening. Ella wore a dress she had, blue cotton, practical and without fuss, and Chester wore a clean shirt and his good hat, and several people from Harlow's Crossing watched them arrive together with the interested attention of a community that had quietly concluded something was developing at the Aldridge homestead. Mrs. Haynes caught Ella's arm and drew her into a conversation, and Chester went to find them something to eat from the tables, and in the 10 minutes he was gone, Mrs. Haynes said with genuine warmth behind the question, "He seems like a good man, Ella." "He's a competent ranch hand," Ella said. Mrs. Haynes laughed, soft and knowing. "Of course he is, dear." Ella did not dignify this with a response. The fiddle started up, a quick and cheerful reel, and people moved onto the cleared grass that served as a dance floor. Chester came back with 2 plates and found her, and they ate standing together in the comfortable way they had developed, side by side rather than face to face, looking at the dancers, talking without the formality of a table between them. He made her laugh twice, genuinely, the full laugh that she didn't deploy often, and she saw him register it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been working toward something specific and patient. Later, when the music slowed to something easier, Chester held out his hand without speech. Ella looked at the hand for a moment. She looked at his face. He was not pressing. He was offering, with that particular quality of his that left the choice entirely with her. She took his hand. They danced, not elaborately. She was not a woman who had spent time learning elaborate dances, and he was not a man who cared about elaborate dances. Just the slow turning of 2 people in the warm lantern-lit air, and his hand was warm on her waist, and he did not hold her like she might break, and he did not hold her like she was a conquest, just like she was a person he was glad to be holding. And she could feel against her chest that particular alarm that she had long since decided was the signal that something mattered, that it was real, and that therefore she was in danger. She let herself dance anyway. On the ride home, the night was wide and full of stars, the way western nights could be when the air was clear and the land was dark in every direction. They rode without hurry, the horses moving at an easy walk on the road they both knew, and the quiet between them was the good kind now, settled and warm. "I haven't danced in a long time," Ella said. "How long?" "My father's last birthday," she said. "He liked dancing. My mother played the piano when we had one." She paused, which was how she handled the mention of her parents, a brief pause that acknowledged the weight of the absence without making a performance of it. "That was a long time ago." "What was he like?" Chester said. No one had asked her that in years. People mentioned her father sometimes, in the way of a community that remembers its dead, but they rarely asked what he had been like, as though asking might cause her pain, and causing her pain was the primary risk to manage around Ella Aldridge. Chester just asked, naturally, as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing to want to know. She told him. She talked about her father more than she had in years, about his laugh and his stubbornness, and the way he could calm a frightened horse better than any man she'd ever seen, and the way he used to read aloud in the evenings, and how the homestead had been built on his specific, visionary certainty that this particular piece of land would sustain them. She talked about her mother, too, and the things her mother had taught her, not just the practical things but the quality of her mother's attention, the way she had looked at the world with an interest that nothing had been able to fully extinguish. Ella talked for a long time, and Chester listened without interrupting, and by the time the homestead came into view at the end of the approach road, she felt lighter than she had in a long time, which she did not entirely trust. She reined in Juniper at the yard gate and dismounted, and Chester did the same, and they stood in the moon-silvered yard with the horses between them, and she looked at him across the horse's back and said, "I don't talk about them much." "I know," he said. I like talking about them, she said, as though confirming something to herself. They sound like people worth talking about, he said. She nodded once and led Juniper to the barn, and he followed with his horse, and they put the horses up in the companionable parallel way of two people who have shared that task enough times that it needs no coordination. And when the horses were settled and they walked back across the yard toward the house, Chester stopped at the barn door and she stopped too, and they stood in the moonlight. He looked at her. She looked at him. The enormous New Mexico night was all around them. He said, very quietly, "Ella." And something in the way he said it, just her name, just that, with all the warmth and all the patience and all the accumulated weeks of paying attention to who she actually was, broke something open in her chest that she had thought was permanently sealed. She stepped toward him. He did not move toward her, waited, as he always waited, until the choice was entirely hers. She put her hand against his jaw and he closed his eyes for just a moment. And then she kissed him, standing in the moonlit yard of her homestead in the summer of 1878, and he kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, fully and without hurry, and she did not pull away. They stood there for a long time in the warm night, and when they finally separated, there was a quiet between them that was unlike any quiet she had ever lived in, full rather than empty, rich rather than lonely. "I'm still not going to need you," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a thread of something in it, something that might have been an apology or a warning or both. Chester looked at her in the moonlight, and his expression was full of the warmth that was simply, she had come to understand, his most honest face. "I know," he said. "I've known that from the start, and I'm still here." "I'm aware," she said, and for the first time without performance or irony she was glad. The summer deepened. The days were enormous and the work was constant, and the territory went about its business with the indifference of a landscape that has endured longer than any of the people moving across it. The 1870s in the New Mexico territory were not gentle times. The land disputes that ran through the region, the complicated and often unjust pressures on both small ranchers and the Pueblo and Apache peoples who had been on this land far longer than any homesteader, existed as the weather of the world they lived in. Ella had always been conscious of this in the practical way of someone who had neighbors of various origins, and who understood that the law in the territories was administered unevenly, and with a convenience that benefited certain people more than others. Chester carried this consciousness too, in the way of a man who had traveled widely and seen enough to understand that the history written on the landscape was not simple, and was not always the history the newspaper told. They talked about it sometimes, on the porch in the evenings, not with solutions, because they did not have solutions, but with the honesty that belonged to people who were trying to see clearly rather than comfortably. He loved her, he knew, with a clarity that had arrived sometime in June and had not wavered since. It was not the dramatic love of sudden arrival. It was the accumulated love of someone who had spent weeks watching a person be entirely themselves, and had found every piece of that person worth loving. Her precision, her refusal to perform softness she didn't feel, her genuine tenderness with animals. The particular way her face changed when she was thinking through something complicated, the slight inward turning of her expression, the focused quiet. The laugh she didn't give easily, and that meant something when it came. The bravery that she didn't call bravery because to her it was just the necessary response to the circumstances. He had not said it yet. He was not in a hurry. He understood, with a patience that was specific to how he felt about her rather than a general quality of his nature, that certain words needed time to be received properly, and that Ella would receive them best when she was ready rather than when he was moved to speak them. She, for her part, was conducting a sustained and private negotiation with her own feelings that she would not have characterized as negotiation, because that implied she had options. She was simply, very slowly, learning to hold something precious without immediately setting it down because she was afraid of dropping it. She was learning to let his presence in her life be a good thing without the constant background fear that it was a structural weakness. She was learning, which was perhaps the most difficult of all, to stop bracing for loss. She did not entirely stop. She was not sure she would ever entirely stop, but she stopped bracing every hour. Some days it was only once. Some evenings, sitting on the porch steps with him in the bruised violet light she loved, she did not brace at all, just sat in the warmth of the evening and the warmth of his company and was, without qualification, glad. In August, they had a problem. A man named Harlan Decker, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had been expanding his land through a combination of purchase and what Ella privately called creative interpretation of boundary lines, sent his foreman to the Aldridge homestead with a document he claimed demonstrated that the south 40 acres of Ella's land had been improperly deeded to her father and were, in the current surveyor's assessment, part of the Decker range. Ella read the document twice, standing in the yard, her face giving nothing away. The foreman, a thin man named Garrett who looked uncomfortable with his errand, waited. "Tell Mr. Decker," Ella said, handing the document back with a precision that was its own kind of refusal, "that my father's deed is registered at the county seat in Santa Fe and that it has been registered there since 1861. If Mr. Decker has concerns about the accuracy of the survey, he is welcome to have it redone at his own expense by a surveyor of the county's choosing and not his own." Garrett took the document. He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect and rode away. Chester had been behind her, having come around from the barn when he heard the writer, and he had listened to this exchange without interrupting, because there was nothing he needed to add. When Garrett was gone, he said, "He'll push further." "I know," Ella said. "That's why I said the county surveyor. You've been through this before. Not with Decker, but men like Decker are not a new invention." She put the matter into its appropriate mental compartment and moved back toward the work she had been doing. Chester fell in beside her. He did not offer to handle it for her. He did not suggest that she might want him to ride to town and speak to the land office on her behalf. He asked what she needed and listened to what she said, and then they went about the necessary steps together, which was the way she needed it. She did ride to Santa Fe the following week, a 2-day journey, to review her deed personally and ensure it was properly registered, and that the boundaries were correctly recorded. Chester held the homestead while she was gone, and when she came back on the second evening, he had supper waiting and the stock had been cared for, and the place was in precisely the order she kept it. She noticed this with a warmth that she did not make obvious. She had brought back, on an impulse she had analyzed and then acted on anyway, a book from a Santa Fe bookseller. It was a collection of essays about the natural world, which she thought he would like based on 3 months of knowing what he liked. She handed it to him over supper without a great deal of ceremony, because ceremony was not how she operated. He looked at it and then at her with an expression that she had come to understand was the look on his face when he felt something deeply. He did not make a performance of it either. He just said thank you and meant it entirely. "It seemed like something you'd read," she said. "It is," he said, and the way he looked at her when he said that was not about the book at all. The Decker situation resolved more quickly than expected, because Ella had anticipated correctly that the county surveyor's independent assessment would confirm what the original deed said. The south 40 acres were hers. Harlan Decker, who was powerful but was not, ultimately, willing to fight a legal battle he could not win without clearly overstepping the law, withdrew his claim with a thinly graceful excuse about a surveying misunderstanding. Ella received this news with the satisfaction of someone who had done the right thing from the beginning, and simply needed the correct people to recognize it. Chester opened a bottle of whiskey he had kept for an occasion, and they drank a small glass each on the porch in the evening, and Ella laughed properly when she described the expression on Harlan Decker's foreman's face, the second time he had come to the homestead with retreat rather than advance on his agenda. September arrived, and with it a change in the air that Ella loved, the first suggestion of fall, the mornings cooling to something almost gentle. The pasture grass had gone from green to gold. The creek was lower than she liked but running. The cattle were in good condition. She was thinking about the fall sale in Tucumcari with the particular satisfaction of a rancher who has had a good year against reasonable expectations. On an early September evening, Chester found her in the garden at the south wall of the house, where she had been harvesting the last of the season's beans. The light was low and golden, the kind that made everything look as though it had been dipped in amber, and she was crouched between the rows with a basket, working methodically, and she did not hear him come up. "Ella," he said. She looked up, reading his face, which had the quality she recognized as something important being held and readied. He crouched down to her level, which put them face to face in the bean garden in the September light, and he said, "I love you. I want to say it plainly because that's how I say things. I'm not expecting you to say anything back, and I'm not saying it to change what we are. I'm saying it because it's true and you deserve to know what is true about how I feel." She looked at him for a long time. The garden was very quiet around them, the late bees still working in the last of the season's flowers along the south wall. She had known it was coming, and she had thought about what she would say, and none of the things she had thought of were adequate, so she said the thing that was real. "I love you too," she said. "I am frightened of it, but I love you." He looked at her with that full, warm attention, and he said, "I know you're frightened. I'm not asking you to stop being frightened. I'm just asking you to let me stay." "You're already staying," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." She reached out and took his hand, right there in the bean garden in the September light, and they stayed crouched among the rows for a moment that was entirely still and entirely full. In October, when the fall sale in Tucumcari had gone well, and the money was properly entered in the ledger, and the ranch was being put to rights for winter, Chester asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, which was not where most proposals happened in the romantic stories she had occasionally read, but it was where they lived their most honest life together, and it seemed right to him, and he had learned to trust his instincts about what seemed right with her. He set his cup down and he said, "I'd like to marry you, if that's something you want, on your terms. This is your land and your life, and a marriage wouldn't change those things. I would be your partner, not your keeper. That's what I'm offering." She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him. She thought about her parents, who had built something real together on difficult ground, and about the years since, and about what it had cost her to be so thoroughly alone, not in the way of someone who lacked resources, but in the way of someone who had never let herself be truly accompanied. She thought about a man who had shown up with a lame horse and a fair mind and had stayed, not because she was easy, because she was not easy, but because who she was, all of it, including the self-sufficiency and the guardedness and the clear-eyed fear, was exactly what he had decided to love. "Yes," she said, "on those terms." Chester smiled, that full, warm smile. "Those are the only terms I'd want," he said. They were married in November in the Harlow's Crossing Church, which had seen enough of life's difficult seasons to be genuinely moved by a love that had arrived with such quiet dignity. Mrs. Haynes cried, which she had predicted she would do and done nothing to prevent. The minister, a patient man named Reverend Coles, who had officiated at enough frontier weddings to understand that the people in front of him today were serious in a way that deserved an equally serious ceremony, conducted a service that was brief and real, and had not a word of extra sentiment that did not belong there. Ella wore the blue dress again, with her mother's brooch pinned at the collar, a small oval piece with a turquoise stone that was the only jewelry she owned, and she wore it with the authority of someone who does not need ornamentation, but chooses it on this particular day, because it carries someone she loves into the occasion. Chester wore his good shirt and a vest he had bought in Santa Fe on one of the supply trips, and a tie that he had spent some time with that morning, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with the same expression he always had when he looked at her, warm and complete, and as though there were no place he would rather be in the world. They exchanged the vows without ceremony of voice, meaning them seriously and saying them simply. When it was done and Reverend Coles indicated they might seal the occasion, Chester kissed her with the same quality as that first kiss in the moonlit yard, fully and without hurry, and she kissed him back, and the room was quietly, warmly pleased. The winter they spent together in the homestead house was the first winter in 9 years that Ella did not feel the particular cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Chester brought into the house not disruption, but a second warmth, a presence that moved alongside hers rather than in its path. They did not give up their individual rhythms. She still rose early with her own purposes. He still had his habits, but the days had a different shape now, one that included another person without subtracting from her. She watched him read by the fire in the evenings, the book from Santa Fe and others she had sourced from the territorial library system, and she worked on the accounts or mended something or simply sat, which was something she had not been able to do in a long time, simply sit without it feeling like wasted time. She found she could rest now, not because anything was easier, the land was still the land and the work was still the work, but because rest had a container now. She did not have to hold everything alone, and so the holding was different. They talked more than she had ever talked to anyone. He told her about the trail years, the drives he had been on, the landscapes he had moved through, Texas and Kansas and the Indian territories, and the particular quality of the high desert. He was a good storyteller when he had a reason to tell stories, and she was a good listener when she trusted the person speaking, which she had learned she trusted him entirely. She told him things she had not said to anyone, about her mother's last months and how she had managed the dying with the same practical determination she brought to everything, and about her father's death, which had been sudden in the way that fevers are sudden, and how she had stood at the graveside in the flat November light and been aware, at 17 years old, that she was now the only one, and had made a decision about what kind of person that required her to be. "You were 17, he said, one night in January when she told him that part. "I was," she said. "That's very young to decide to be entirely sufficient," he said, not as a criticism, as an acknowledgement. "I didn't think of it that way," she said. "I thought of it as mathematics." "I know," he said. "That's not a criticism. It got you through. It was the right tool for the time." He looked at her steadily. "You don't need it as the only tool anymore." She considered this. It was one of the things about him, this quality of being able to say something genuinely important without making her feel managed or diminished in the saying of it. He told her things that were true and he let her receive them at her own speed. "I'm aware," she said, which was her way of saying she was working on it. By spring of 1879, the homestead was running better than it had in years. Not because Chester had changed it, because Ella had always run it well, but because there were now 2 capable people doing the work of 2, which left margin. Margin for planning rather than just responding, margin for maintenance before things broke rather than after, margin for the kind of thinking that goes with a life rather than just a survival. Ella was different, and she knew it, and the knowing did not frighten her the way it would have 2 years ago. She was still the woman she had always been, direct and capable and self-contained in the essential ways. But she had allowed something to exist alongside those things, which was simply the fact of another person, genuinely known and genuinely present, and she had discovered that the architecture she had built to survive alone did not collapse under the weight of love. It held. It simply had more room in it now. In late spring, she told Chester she thought she might be pregnant. She told him in the same direct, factual way she told him most things, standing in the kitchen in the morning with her coffee, and he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, which was a kind of awe that had nothing performative about it. "Are you?" he started and then stopped, rearranging himself. "How do you feel about it?" he asked, which was the right question, the one that put her experience first. "Uncertain," she said honestly, "and glad both at once." He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let him, which was its own quiet landmark. She stood in the circle of his arms in the spring morning and let herself be held, and she thought about her mother holding her in the kitchen of this same house a long time ago, and she thought that continuity was one of the better things about human life. The pregnancy was straightforward in the physical sense, which she had expected because she was healthy and strong and practical about her body. She continued working through most of it, which Chester did not argue with because he had learned that her self-knowledge was reliable, but he quietly adjusted which tasks fell to him without announcing the adjustment, and she noted it and did not acknowledge it verbally, which was their way. On a morning in early November of 1879, in the bedroom of the Aldridge homestead house, with the midwife from Harlow's Crossing in Chester's hand, which she held with a grip that would have concerned him if he had been inclined to concern himself with such things, which he was not, she gave birth to a son. They named him William, after her father, which Chester had suggested, and which she had accepted without debate because it was exactly right and she had been thinking it too. William Redmond came into the world with good lungs and dark hair, and the particular intensity of expression that newborns sometimes have, as though they are very seriously taking stock of the situation. Chester held him that first evening while Ella rested, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the child in his arms and the particular stillness of a new father who is understanding something about the weight of a person, and Ella watched him from the bed with an openness she had stopped fighting months ago. He looked up and found her watching. "He's extraordinary," Chester said. His voice was rough in the way it got when he was feeling something deeply. "He's very small," Ella said. "Small and extraordinary," Chester said, "like his mother." She gave him the look that was her version of deep affection, which was a slight softening of the eyes and a mouth that wanted to smile and mostly succeeded. "Don't be foolish," she said. "I'm accurate," he said, with the particular smile that meant he was deliberately using her own language back at her. She laughed. The room was warm and the child was sleeping, and it was November, and the land outside the window was turning toward winter, the same land that had taken so much from her and that had given her, in the end, this. William grew as healthy children do, steadily and with enthusiasm for the world, and the homestead grew around him in the way that working places grow when there is good intention behind them. Chester invested his own savings in a small expansion of the cattle herd in the spring of 1880, which Ella reviewed and approved with the precision she brought to all financial decisions. They acquired 2 more horses. The barn got a proper repair. The house got a new addition on the east side. Another bedroom built through the summer by both of their hands and some borrowed labor from a neighboring ranch family, the Garcias, who had been their friends for 2 years in the quiet, practical way of frontier neighbors, who understood that mutual aid was not weakness but sense. The Garcia family were themselves a reflection of the territory's complex humanity. Miguel Garcia was the son of a Mexican land-grant family who had been on this ground before there was a New Mexico territory to speak of. And his wife, Clara, was a Tejana woman whose family had navigated the decades of shifting sovereignty, with the pragmatic resilience of people who understood that the borders moved but the land remained. They were good neighbors and good people, and they had children who played with William when he was old enough to play, which was earlier than seemed reasonable and later than William's own ambitions suggested. Harlow's Crossing was not always a kind place. No frontier town of the 1880s was. There were injustices of the ordinary kind, the land and law that favored those with connections and power, the treatment of Mexican and indigenous people that ranged from indifferent to actively hostile depending on the day and who was doing the treating. Ella and Chester did not have the power to remedy these things on a structural level, and they knew it, but they conducted their own dealings with fairness and their own friendships without the artificial hierarchies that others accepted as natural. This was not heroism. It was their particular understanding of what was decent, and they acted on it consistently. Life in the territory in the early 1880s had its own momentum, the railroad pushing further in, towns growing or dying based on which direction the line went, cattle markets shifting, the ongoing transformation of open range into fenced land that changed the nature of ranching forever. Ella watched these changes with the sharp, practical attention she brought to everything. She and Chester talked through what they meant for the Aldridge homestead, now officially the Redmond Ranch on the county records, though Ella kept the Aldridge name on the deed as a second party because her parents had built it, and she intended their name to stay in the soil. In the spring of 1882, their daughter arrived. They named her Margaret, after Chester's mother, who had died when he was 12, a woman he remembered with the careful affection of someone who had held onto a memory a long time. Margaret Redmond was born in April when the land was beginning its turn toward green, and she had her mother's gray eyes and her father's propensity for stillness, and she regarded the world from her very first weeks with a calm assessment that made Ella, watching her, feel something like recognition. William, at 2.5, was extremely interested in his sister, and expressed this interest with the comprehensive physical investigation of a toddler, requiring supervision that added a new dimension to the household's daily operations, and that Chester handled with a humor and patience that Ella found, on a daily basis, genuinely admirable. "You're good at this," she told him one evening, watching him manage William's enthusiastic approach to the sleeping infant with the gentle firmness that redirected without deflating. "I had good reason to figure it out," he said. "That's not an explanation," she said. "Sure it is," he said. "I have you and these two to care about." "That's a very good reason to rise to the occasion." She looked at him with the full directness that she had stopped softening, because she had learned that he did not need it softened and that her directness, in fact, was something he loved rather than something he managed. "You are sometimes unreasonably earnest," she said. "I know," he said. "You've told me." "I'll keep telling you," she said. And there was such warmth under it, such ease, that he smiled and went back to William, and she went back to what she was doing, and the house held them all in the ordinary way of a good life, which is to say without drama or announcement, just with the steady, accumulated warmth of people who have chosen each other and kept on choosing. The years passed with the specific quality that good years have, full enough that they do not drag and deep enough that they do not seem to pass too quickly until you look back. William grew into a boy who was methodical like his mother and curious like his father, and who had a particular gift for anything involving animals, which pleased Ella in the way that watching a specific aptitude develop in a child will please even the most matter-of-fact parent. He was following her through the pasture at 5 years old, asking the names and ages of every horse, and by 7, he was helping with their care with a quiet competence that was recognizably Ella's quality in a smaller body. Margaret was different, more verbal, quicker to laughter, with an ease in social situations that her mother did not have, and that she had clearly inherited from Chester's more open quality. She made friends with the Garcia children without effort, and organized their play with a cheerful authority that was recognizably her mother's quality, which amused Chester, and which Ella acknowledged with the slightly startled recognition of seeing herself in someone else. The homestead thrived. Not in the exaggerated way of stories that require everything to build to grand prosperity, but in the real way, which was year-by-year improvement, setback met and addressed, the good years outweighing the hard ones over time, the land producing at a rate that allowed for saving rather than just surviving. They expanded the cattle herd and added a small sheep operation at Ella's instigation, having done the arithmetic on what the wool market would bear. And the arithmetic, as her arithmetic generally did, proved to be correct. Chester had become, in the years of working the homestead, something he had not quite been when he arrived, not just a skilled ranch hand but a genuine rancher, with the specific knowledge that comes from long acquaintance with a particular piece of land. He knew the Aldridge Redmond ground as well as Ella did now, knew its moods and its tendencies, where the water ran best in dry years and where the grass held through drought, and which sections of fence needed attention every spring. He had put his hands into this land for years, and the land had made its return. In the summer of 1885, they had a difficult season. A drought came in through July and August that was severe enough to drop the creek to a trickle and pull the pasture grass brown before its time, and several head of cattle died from the combination of heat and poor water access. They lost approximately a third of the summer's expected gain. Ella took the hit with the stone-faced arithmetic of someone who has survived worse and will survive this, and Chester worked beside her through the hard weeks without complaint, hauling water from the well to the surviving stock, making decisions with her about which animals to sell early before they lost further condition, cutting losses in the calculated way of experienced ranchers. On the worst night of it, a night in August when the heat did not break and the stock was restless and they were both exhausted in the bone-deep way of sustained emergency, they sat on the porch after midnight because the house was too hot to sleep, and Chester said, "We'll come back from this." "I know," Ella said. She had her head against his shoulder, which was something she did now without having to think about it, a thing she had simply learned over 7 years of marriage, the ease of letting someone be your rest. "We've had bad years before." "The sheep will help," he said. "Yes," she said. "The wool price is reliable even when cattle aren't." She paused. "I was right about the sheep." "You were absolutely right about the sheep," he said with a warmth that had a thread of humor in it. "I usually am," she said, and she was smiling in the dark against his shoulder even in the middle of a hard season. "I know," he said. They came back from the drought as she had known they would, because that was what you did in this territory. You came back from things. The following 2 years were good ones, rainfall near average, the market steady, the operation running on the experience of a rancher who had now been at this land for nearly a decade and had made the mistakes early enough to have learned from them. The Redmond Ranch had a reputation in the county now, a good one, the reputation that comes from consistency and fair dealing, from neighbors who knew you would honor your word and the land office people who found your records accurate and your boundaries respected. Ella was 35 in the year 1887, and she was not the same woman who had watched Chester Redmond ride down her approach road with a lame horse 9 years earlier. She was older, which was obvious, and which the New Mexico territory had put its marks on in the way the land marks everyone who stays long enough. There were lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into bright sun, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had worked hard land for a long time, capable and scarred, and she wore none of these marks with apology. But she was also different in the way that matters more, the way that happens inside rather than on the surface. She was a woman who had learned, against her own most disciplined resistance, to be accompanied. She had learned to let another person see her uncertainty and not experience the exposure as catastrophic. She had learned that the architecture of her self-sufficiency had not needed to come down for love to have a place in it, that she had simply needed to put a door in a wall she had built solid, and that Chester had been patient enough to wait for her to put the door in herself. She had learned that being known, fully and without the edits she usually made before presenting herself to the world, was not the danger she had believed it to be. That the right person, the genuinely right person, would find the truth of her not a burden to manage but a person to love. That she did not need anyone in the helpless, dependent way she had feared. She needed Chester the way you need light, not because you cannot physically exist without it, but because everything is better, more visible, more richly seen in its presence. She told him this once, on a quiet evening in the fall of 1887, sitting on the porch steps in the bruised violet light she had always loved. William was 11 and inside, reading by the lamp. Margaret was 8 and had fallen asleep on the settee, which she often did, falling asleep mid-evening as though she simply ran out of steam without warning and went down wherever she happened to be. The land was going toward its autumn colors, the scrub grass gold, the sky immense and slowly darkening. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I'm here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I want to tell you. I know you're here. I'm no longer surprised by it." She looked at her hands, then at the horizon. "For a long time I was surprised every day. Every morning I was slightly amazed that you had not left." She paused. "I'm not surprised anymore. I expect you. I know you're here. I want to tell you that that is the most significant thing that has ever changed in me." Chester was quiet for a moment. The light was almost gone now, that last purple before full dark. "Do you know what I think?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think you were never as closed as you believed yourself to be," he said. "I think you had made a very sound, very practical decision that you enforced rigorously. And I think when you decided I had earned the right to be let in, you let me in fully. That is not the act of a closed person. That is the act of someone who knows the value of what they are giving." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You see things very clearly." "You taught me," he said. "You see more clearly than anyone I have ever known. I just learned to look at the same things." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together as the dark completed itself, and the stars came out over the New Mexico territory, enormous and specific and impossibly numerous. The same stars that had been out over this land for all the years she had sat on this porch, first alone and now accompanied. They sat there until the air was fully cool and she could hear through the open window that William had put down his book and was preparing for bed. She squeezed Chester's hand once before she stood. "Come inside," she said. "In a minute," he said. "I want to look at this a little longer." She looked at him, looking at the sky, the man she had been most afraid to love and had loved most completely, and she felt, in a way that was simple and complete and required no further architecture, entirely at home. She went inside and checked on Margaret, who was still sleeping on the settee, and she lifted the small, warm weight of her daughter and carried her to her bed, and Margaret stirred slightly and said something unintelligible and was back asleep before Ella had pulled the blanket up. She stopped in William's doorway and said good night, and William said good night back in the serious, quiet way that was so recognizably his mother's. Chester came inside a little later, the screen door closing softly behind him, and he crossed the kitchen where the lamp was burning low and came to her where she was standing at the window with a last cup of tea. He put his arms around her from behind and she leaned back against him, and they stood there in the kitchen of the house her parents had built and that she had kept, and that was theirs now, entirely and irrevocably theirs, and the land was dark and still outside the window, and everything was, in the most complete sense she had ever known the word, enough. In the spring of 1888, they planted a kitchen garden larger than the one she had always kept, because William had taken an interest, and because Margaret had opinions about what should go in it, and Chester built a second raised bed along the south wall, and Ella taught both children how to turn the soil and set the seeds with the same patient precision her mother had used to teach her. She stood back one Saturday morning and watched Chester showing William how to properly space bean seeds in the furrow, and Margaret on the other side of the garden doing something with great enthusiasm that may or may not have been correctly following instructions. And the April sun was warm, and the soil smelled the way spring soil smells, mineral and living, and she stood in the middle of this ordinary morning and was aware, with a completeness that needed nothing added to it, of how full her life had become. Not because it was easy, not because the land had stopped being hard or the weather reliable or the work undemanding, but because she was in it with people, real people who knew her and whom she knew, and because the love she had avoided for so many years out of the sound and reasonable fear of loss had turned out to be, when it finally arrived in the form of a man with a lame horse and a quiet quality of attention, exactly as large as she had feared and also exactly survivable. More than survivable. Worth it, she thought. Worth every careful, terrified step from the morning she had watched him ride away toward town and found herself thinking about him before noon. Worth the slow, painstaking work of learning to trust something you could lose. Worth the morning she had spent deciding, again, to be open rather than defended. Worth every moment of the choice. Chester looked up from the bean furrow and found her watching and smiled, the full, warm smile that had not changed in 10 years, and that she expected she would see on his face for whatever years of good life remained to them both. And she smiled back with the completeness of a woman who had stopped being surprised by her own happiness and had settled into the daily, magnificent fact of it. William carefully placed a seed in the soil. Margaret declared that her section of the garden was finished, which required investigation. The April light was generous over the red New Mexico ground. The horses were moving in the far pasture, and somewhere along the south fence line, a meadowlark was making an argument for the particular beauty of the morning. The creek was running full, a good sign, and the grass was coming in green after a winter that had been cold but not brutal, and the cattle were in good weight, and the accounts were in order, and the roof held. Ella Aldridge had spent her life proving she did not need anyone. Chester Redmond had been the first person to say he knew, and to stay anyway. And what she had found, in the years since that night in the bean garden when she had told him she was frightened and he had said he would stay regardless, was that a love that does not demand your vulnerability but simply makes room for it, quietly and without pressure, is the kind of love that a self-sufficient woman can actually receive. Not because it changes who she is, because it never asked her to change at all. The Redmond Ranch stood on its 73 acres under the wide New Mexico sky, and it would stand there for a long time, because the people who kept it knew how to keep things, and they knew how to do it together, and that was the kind of mathematics that added up to something worth the counting.